I'd like to read out of this morning is by Megan McKenna, who has written just a number of wonderful books, and she's mostly a storyteller, so she tells wonderful stories. I'm going to share one of them in just a little bit. But she's talking about this story of Jesus in the wilderness, and she says this: "The temptation in the wilderness story is short and powerful. The Spirit sends Jesus out toward the desert," or in some translations it has him driven out into the desert. The desert in the Jewish tradition is the place of transition between slavery and oppression, and the making of a people into the children of God, ready to enter into the promised land of their dreams. It is a period of testing, of letting go of what was before so that what is to come can enter into them. It is also a time of privilege, of intimacy with God alone, who leads and teaches them in the deepest recesses of their hearts, so that they come to know that home is where God is within them.
Our scripture reading today is found in Mark chapter 1, verses 9 through 15. It was then that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan River by John. Immediately upon coming out of the water, Jesus saw the heavens open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Then a voice came from the heavens: "You are my beloved, my own. On you my favor rests." Immediately the Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness, and he remained there for 40 days and was tempted by Satan. He was with the wild beasts, and the angels looked after him. After John's arrest, Jesus appeared in Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. This is the time of fulfillment. The reign of God is at hand. Change your hearts and minds and believe this good news. Here ends the reading.
Would you pray with me? God of the journey, as we travel this road together, and especially as we begin this Lenten walk, may you be with us. May we be consciously with you. May we dwell in a space where we are intentional about our thoughts and our actions and our decisions, where we don't just drift through our days mindlessly on autopilot, but thinking about who we are and whose we are and how we want to live. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your strength, your courage, and your wisdom. Amen. So this Wednesday is known in the Christian calendar as Ash Wednesday, and it officially begins the 40 days of Lent, from Ash Wednesday to Easter. If you count that out, you're going to come up with more than 40, but Sundays don't count, because the church said so. It's because Sundays are supposed to be little Easters. They're supposed to be little celebrations, so they're not supposed to be counted in the seriousness of the Lenten season. So we have 40 days, which obviously mirrors the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. Those 40 days in the wilderness were his time to prepare emotionally, physically, spiritually for his ministry, to prepare to go out and to preach the good news of God. Now, in the book of Mark, we have the shortest version of this story. And we remember that Mark is the earliest gospel of the four. And so we know that the tradition sort of grew. The story grew as the years went on. But it's kind of nice to have just this little short pericope that says, Jesus went out in the wilderness and was tempted by Satan, but the angels and the animals were with him. And then when he was done, he went out and he preached the good news of God. it's interesting how the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke, expand upon that conversation with Satan. But for us today, that vagueness, I think, allows us to put ourselves more easily into the story, to enter into it ourselves, as if it were our story, as if it were our challenge to go out into the wilderness. So Megan McKenna reminds us that in Jewish tradition, the wilderness, or the desert, as it would be in that part of the country, rocks, and scrub brush, and sand, and no place that any of us wants to spend much time. That the wilderness reminded the Jews of Moses' time in the desert after they'd escaped from Egypt. And so it's metaphorically a place of transition, a place of transition where the people were going from a place of oppression and slavery to a place of freedom, but also of commitment to God as the children of God. If you think about Jesus for a minute, he was consistently compassionate, loving, kind. He was stable as a spiritual leader. He didn't waver in his path or his integrity, at least as far as we know. How did he get to be that way? It seems like there had to have at some point been a time where he consciously decided how he was going to move forward, how he was going to approach the decisions he'd have to make, or how he would treat people, how he would approach situations, how he would preach about God. And I think that perhaps this story of Jesus in the wilderness has been our way of explaining that he took time to make those choices, to really think about how he was going to go forward in his life and remain consistent to it. So what if we all take the next 40 days and become intentional about it being our time in the wilderness, our time to make choices for how we will go forward in our lives, how we will make decisions, how we will treat other people. So what happened in the wilderness is that Jesus went out and Satan went out and quote unquote tempted him. Now in Greek, Satan means hinderer. Satan becomes a characterization of the voices of the world. There's a tension that exists in the wilderness between the voices of the world and the voices of the spiritual path. And Satan is the characterization of these voices of the world calling all of us, calling Jesus to be drawn into worldly things, into the illusions of the world, as opposed to walking that pure spiritual path. And so if we're on a path now in the wilderness, if we're heading out there, as Megan McKenna would say, into the privilege and the intimacy of drawing close to God with the intent that we be led and guided down our spiritual path, down a path that reminds us that the divine dwells within. If that's where we're heading on this journey for the next 40 days, then we're also going to experience that tension between the illusory things of the world that call to us, but that are impermanent, or the things of the Spirit that want to draw us down a path that leads us closer and closer to the divine within. So flesh these two things out for me, okay? If we're being tempted by the voices of the world, what does that sound like? What do those voices call to us about? Buy more. Want. I want, I want, I want. You must have more. Greed. Can we just say greed? What else?
You deserve better.
You deserve better. So does that come from an ego place of pride? Is that okay? Envy? What else? What else? The need to produce more and more. What about power and violence, punishment, judgment, hierarchy? Maybe that's that you deserve to be up here. Or maybe it's about fear, about anger, and about hatred. Maybe it's about getting caught up in self-loathing and self-worthlessness because of the things that the world says we have to be and have to look like and have to achieve. Maybe it's a negativity or a complaining about everything that is and isn't. Does that make sense? All of those voices of the world that want to draw us down that path, tempt us to be caught up in all of those sorts of things that roil around in our heads and draw us down a path that's inevitably contractive and negative and really hurtful for our souls as we just get caught up in that spiral of negativity or pain or anger. So what's on the other side? What are the voices of the Spirit? Joy, generosity, and patience, peace,
A full cup.
a full cup, love, motivation and inspiration, simple pleasures, interdependence, forgiveness, accepting outcomes, compassion, kindness, empathy. So those are the sets of choices. And whatever situation we come up against, whatever difficult person we have to deal with, we have the voices of the world on one side calling us here, and we have the voices of the Spirit calling us here. So we got someone driving us nuts, and we either turn to judgment and we turn to anger, or we turn to trying perhaps understanding, inclusion, acceptance. So every time we can make a choice that's for the voices of the Spirit, that's a beautiful thing. It takes us a little bit further down this road. But there's a tricky part. Here's a story. Once upon a time, there was a king, and he was a good king. He was kind and he was generous. And one day, there was a master who came into the kingdom and he was preaching, and the king listened to the master preaching and thought, I want to follow this man. I want to be a disciple. And so he presented himself to the master and said, I'm ready to stop being a king. I want to be your disciple. Will you take me on? And the master looked at him and said, you know it's going to be really hard to stop being a king. And the king didn't say anything. The master said, well, tell you what, I'll take you on a probationary basis. You come, and I will give you tasks to do, and then I will decide when you're ready to be a disciple. And the king agreed. The master said, you're going to have to learn how to unlearn how to be a king. The king said, well, this is my path now. I'm good with this. And so the king was welcomed into the group. And the first thing the master did was assign him his tasks. And his tasks were to 3 times a day take out the garbage and the slop pails and the chamber pots. And so for weeks, the king did his chores 3 times a day, never complaining. And the other disciples watched him, and they started to feel kind of bad for him, because it's really hard to see the guy who was their king reduced to this. And so a few of the other disciples went to the master and said, can't he be a disciple now? He's been doing this for a couple weeks. He hasn't complained. He's a good guy. And the master said, not ready yet. But the disciples pushed him, and the master said, okay, number 1 disciple, go test him. And so the number 1 disciple went and met him in the grand hall with the marble floors, and the king's carrying his full slop pails to take him out. And the number 1 disciple walks up to him and he shoves him. And his slop pails spill all over the floor. And the king is just boiling with anger, and he's red-faced, and he looks at the guy and he says, it's a good thing I'm not your king anymore, or you would be severely punished. But I'm not, so you can get away with it. And he cleans up his slop pails. The number 1 disciple goes back to the master and reports what happened, and the master said, I told you so. He's not ready yet. Well, a few more weeks and months went by, and the king is still doing all of these chores 3 times a day, and he's not complaining, and the disciples are starting to feel bad again. They're like, our lot was made better in life. We were poor, we were nothing. Now we've got this great place to live, we got food. But the king, he was a king, and now he's living here and having to do these awful tasks. And so they went back to the master, and they said, really, he's got to be ready now. He's been good about this, he's not complaining. Can he be a disciple yet? And the master said, he's not ready yet. And they begged him again, and he said, fine. And so he sent his number 1 disciple again to test him. And the number 1 disciple met him in the grand hall again and walks up to him as he's carrying his slop pails, and he shoves him again. And the slop pails go all over the place. And the king doesn't say anything. He just stands there. But you can see in his eyes that he's ready to kill. His face is turning red, his hands are clenched, but he doesn't say anything. He turns and he starts to clean up all the slop, and the number 1 disciple goes back to the master and reports what happened, and the master said, I told you so. He's not ready yet. Well, a few more months go by, and everybody's starting to get to know the king now. And they find out that he's a really good guy. He's courteous, and he's honest, and he's kind, and he's reflective, and he's interesting. And he's never spoken about the humiliation that he's been put through. He's never been spoken about the treatment of that number 1 disciple. And so a bigger group of disciples go to the master this time. And they say, look, he's ready. We know he's ready. Test him now. The master said, okay. Sent that number 1 disciple back to the grand hall. Waited until the king was coming through with those slop buckets. The king saw him, stood there. They eyed each other up. King walked over, or the first disciple walked over, and he shoves him hard. And those slop pails slop all over the place. The king just stands there and looks at him mildly. So the number 1 disciple walks up to him and he shoves him harder. And the slop pails go flying. And the king smiles and bows. And the number 1 disciple went back to the master and reported what happened. And the master said, now he's ready to be a disciple. And he said to that number 1 disciple, he said, now I want you to go and find him and tell him to come to me. And now you will be doing his chores. because he will be the number one disciple. So, making the choice to simply do the task was not all that was required of this master to be a disciple. What was required? It's acceptance, understanding, forgiveness, compassion,
Humility.
humility.
Thinking whether or not what he was doing was the appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, thinking whether what he was doing was the appropriate thing to do. But it's an inner change, right? It's a complete change of being. It wasn't just an outward change. He had to change inside as well. So while we take this Lenten walk and have to decide whether we're going to listen to the voices of the world or the voices of the Spirit, it's great to listen to the voices of the Spirit. But if inside we're still judging and angry and punishing and violent or self-loathing or whatever it is, we're not quite there yet. And I think it takes just continuing to walk that path and to make the good choices and to be reflective about it until we begin to change inside and our insides match our outsides. And I think that's who Jesus was. He was somebody whose insides matched his outsides consistently. And that's the path we take. The path I invite all of us on because I'm right there with you. It's more than a 40-day path. It's like a lifelong path. But Lent is a really good reason to start. Amen.